Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into what is essentially a massive, ancient detective story. We're going to peel back the layers of pop culture myth that have piled up over 3 whole millennia to reveal the actual original text of the Trojan War, along with the very real archaeological dirt beneath them. If you think you know the story of Troy, well, get ready, because the original sources are probably going to surprise you. To get us started, I want to hook you immediately with a bit of a trick question to challenge what we all assume about the most famous Greek hero of all time. So think back to everything you know about the Trojan War. How exactly does Achilles die in Homer's Iliad? Trick question. He actually doesn't. Seriously, if you were picturing an arrow striking him right in the heel, you were thinking of a completely different book. That famous death scene isn't in the version Homer wrote at all. It was popularized centuries later by Roman poets, most notably Ovid in his Metamorphoses. In the actual Iliad itself, Achilles is very much alive when the story ends.
Okay, let's dive into this and dismantle some major preconceived notions. Not only is Achilles' death totally missing from the Iliad, but so is the Trojan Horse. Literally, it's not there. It actually shows up later in the Odyssey. And historians now believe the horse probably wasn't a literal wooden statue anyway. It was likely a poetic description of a siege machine, or maybe even a metaphor for an earthquake caused by Poseidon, who, fun fact, was the god of both earthquakes and horses, breaching the city walls. And that famous one-eyed Cyclops? Homer never actually explicitly says he only has one eye. The ancient Greeks likely found fossilized skulls of prehistoric dwarf elephants. If you look at one, the massive central nasal cavity looks exactly like a single giant eye socket. It's crazy, right? We've basically been projecting these pop culture myths backward.
To truly understand these stories, we have to contrast the 2 epic poems themselves, because they are fundamentally different beasts. The Iliad doesn't cover a 10-year war. It covers just about 51 days in the 10th year of the war. It's entirely driven by passion, the quest for honor, and specifically, the devastating rage or menace of Achilles. The Odyssey, on the other hand, covers a grueling 10-year journey home after the war. It completely shifts gears. It's a story driven not by brawn, but by wit, delayed responses, and intellect.
Let's look at the narrative structure shaping that rage. Analyzing the plot reveals that the Iliad is driven by 2 massive, exhausting emotional cycles of action and misfortune. The first cycle is entirely built around Achilles being furious and refusing to fight because his honor was insulted. The second, main cycle, hits its absolute climax when his dear friend Patroclus dies. That tragedy pulls Achilles back into the war in a blind fury, guaranteeing a tragic, bloody resolution.
Let's move to the Odyssey and see how this builds, because the sequel operates on a much more complex 3-cycle structure. It begins with the goddess Athena promoting Odysseus' return, moves right into a 2nd cycle, where Odysseus recounts his wild adventures, and then culminates in a 3rd cycle, where he finally slays the suitors and reunites with his wife, Penelope. It's an adventure of survival and return, not a static siege of doom.
Section 1. The Math of a Tragedy, charting the emotional linguistics of Homer.
And this brilliantly illustrates how that structural difference can actually be mapped mathematically. Researcher Cynthia Wissel used a dictionary of affect to graph the emotional plots of both epics over time, literally word by word. For the Iliad, on the left, the entire graph stays completely above the average fortune line, stuck in the misfortune zone. It's a relentless, unbroken wave of unpleasantness, a perfect tragedy that satisfies all of Aristotle's requirements. But look at the Odyssey on the right. Almost the entire story dips into pleasant fortune. Only the final bloody climax spikes into misfortune. Mathematically speaking, the Odyssey is a romance.
The vocabulary backs this up perfectly too. The Iliad relies heavily on active, concrete language like weapons and ships, aligning with Eris, the god of war, which totally cements its status as a tragedy. The Odyssey shifts to abstract, passive words like leadership and worry. It's guided by Athena, the goddess of wisdom, shifting the epic firmly into the territory of romance and survival.
Section 2. Brains versus brawn. The differing philosophies of Greek heroes.
So the crucial point is that these mathematical and linguistic differences perfectly mirror our protagonists. They represent completely different ancient Greek philosophies of what it means to be a hero, how to survive, and how to define honor. Achilles is a creature of raw, unfiltered emotion. He's born a demigod, destined to die young in a blaze of glory, and is ultimately undone by a physical weakness. Odysseus? He's a self-made hero. He doesn't survive because he hits the hardest. He survives through calculation, intellect, and the absolutely vital ability to delay his emotional responses.
The absolute textbook demonstration of this Odyssean thinking is his famous encounter with the perceived monster, the Cyclops. When Odysseus realizes his men are trapped by a giant who is literally eating them, his first, Iliad-style warrior impulse is to just stab the guy in the liver. But he stops. He realizes if he kills the giant, the cave remains sealed by a massive boulder, and they all die anyway. So he uses his brain. He formulates the brilliant linguistic trick of calling himself no man or nobody. He blinds the monster instead of killing him, and then he uses the giant's own daily routine to escape, strapping his men underneath the flock of rams. Slow, calculating brains completely outmaneuvering swift, powerful brawn.
Section 3. Digging up real Troy. Anchoring the myth in the archaeological dirt. Now, to see if any of this actually happened, we have to look at the 16 years of modern excavation carried out by over 350 scholars and scientists at the real site of Troy in northwestern Turkey. And the archaeologists found an incredible historical timeline. The poetic meter Homer used, the hexameter, was already in use by the 15th century BC. By the 13th century BC, a kingdom known as Walusa, which is Troy, was powerful enough to sign treaties with the massive Hittite Empire. And right around 1180 BC, the archaeological layer known as Troy 7a was destroyed, showing absolutely clear evidence of a brutal siege. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this physical evidence definitively kills the old argument that Bronze Age Troy was just some dusty, insignificant town not worth a 10-year war. Excavations prove Troy was a massive city of super-regional importance. It was incredibly rich, controlling the vital sea access from the Mediterranean Strait to the Black Sea. With physical evidence of burned structures, defensive wall repairs, and scattered bronze spear points all over the place, we know for a fact that it was repeatedly attacked and had to defend itself. The foundation of a real pivotal war is historically sound. Section 4. The Homeric question. Who actually wrote these epics?
So if the archaeology proves a massive war happened in 1180 BC, but the popular details are myths and our highly structured poems were recorded centuries later, who actually wrote them? Well, modern scholarship largely agrees that Homer wasn't just a single blind genius sitting at a desk. These poems are actually the culmination of a vast, protracted oral tradition, improvised, adapted, and transmitted by countless singers and bards over several generations. They are basically an ancient game of telephone, filtering the cultural memory of a real Bronze Age collapse through centuries of evolving Greek philosophy. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. If Homer wasn't one person, but rather the collective voice of generations of bards spanning centuries, whose memories of the Trojan War are we actually reading? Are we reading the history of the soldiers who died in the dirt at Troy? Or are we reading the evolving soul of a civilization trying to understand its own past? It's a magnificent blend of historical memory and collective myth. I highly encourage you to go back and explore these foundational texts for yourself, keeping the real archaeology in mind. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the myths.